Lights of the International Hotel in Las Vegas had barely faded when the roar of 18,000 fans finally dissolved into the quiet hum of backstage corridors. For nearly 90 minutes, Elvis Presley had given everything he had. Sweat soaked through the collar of his black jumpsuit. His voice still echoed inside the empty arena as stagehands quietly rolled away amplifiers and microphone stands. Outside, hundreds of fans remained behind velvet barricades, hoping for one last glimpse of the king. Inside his dressing room, however, silence finally settled. Elvis loosened the scarf around his neck and smiled tiredly at Charlie Hodge. "I don't know how they still have the energy," Elvis joked, nodding toward the screaming crowd outside. Charlie laughed. "They're saying the same thing about you." Elvis chuckled, but only for a moment. Behind every sold-out concert was a man who was becoming increasingly exhausted. Fame could make millions believe you were unstoppable. Your body knew otherwise. He poured himself a glass of water and stared into the mirror. The reflection wasn't the confident 20-year-old who had shocked America 2 decades earlier. There were faint lines beneath his eyes now. His smile came slower. His shoulders carried invisible weight. Sometimes he wondered if people came to see Elvis Presley, or simply to remember who Elvis Presley used to be. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Joe Esposito stepped inside holding a cordless telephone. "Elvis." Joe's voice sounded unusually serious. "You've got a call." Elvis raised an eyebrow. "At this hour?" Joe nodded. "He says it's important." Elvis reached for the receiver. "This is Elvis." For a second, nothing. Then came a deep, familiar voice. "Elvis." It was unmistakable. John Wayne. The legendary actor sounded older than usual. Not weak, not frightened, just heavy. Elvis smiled immediately. "Duke, didn't expect to hear from you tonight." Normally, John Wayne would respond with one of his dry jokes. Tonight, he didn't. "Son," there was a pause. "I need to ask you something." Elvis leaned back in his chair. "Anything." Another silence. Longer this time. "I've never called to ask you for a favor." "No." "You haven't." "But tonight I am." Elvis sat up. John Wayne was one of the proudest men he had ever met. He wasn't the kind of man who asked anyone for help. Especially not celebrities. Especially not friends. "What do you need?" Wayne inhaled slowly. "There's a man at St. Mary's Hospital." Elvis waited. "He's dying." The room suddenly felt much quieter. "He served in Vietnam." Another pause. "He doesn't have much time left." Elvis lowered his eyes. John continued. "He asked for one thing." "What is it?" "He wants to hear you sing." Elvis blinked. "Me?" "Yes. He isn't asking for a concert." "No. He isn't asking for reporters." "No. He doesn't want anyone to know." John's voice cracked almost imperceptibly. "He just wants to meet the man whose records kept him alive overseas." Elvis looked toward the dressing room window. Outside, fans were still chanting his name. Thousands of people waited hours just to wave at him. Yet, somewhere across the city, one man wasn't asking for autographs. He wasn't asking for photographs. He wasn't asking for fame. He simply wanted to spend a few minutes with another human being before saying goodbye to life. "When?" Elvis asked softly. John answered immediately. "Tonight." There was no hesitation. "I'll come." John didn't speak for several seconds. Finally, he whispered, "I knew you would." The line disconnected. Joe Esposito looked at Elvis. "What happened?" Elvis stood and reached for his leather jacket hanging beside the mirror. "We're going somewhere." Joe frowned. "Now?" "Now." Charlie looked confused. "What about the press outside?" Elvis smiled. "They'll survive." Within minutes, they slipped through a private exit behind the hotel. No flashing cameras, no security announcement, just one black Cadillac disappearing into the Nevada night. The streets of Las Vegas looked different after midnight. Neon lights reflected across empty sidewalks. Casinos continued roaring with life, while ordinary neighborhoods slept peacefully beneath the desert sky. No one inside the car spoke very much. Elvis rested one hand against the window. He watched strangers walking beneath glowing signs. Couples laughing, taxi drivers rushing passengers, people celebrating victories at roulette tables. Life continued everywhere, except inside one hospital room. After nearly 30 minutes, they arrived. St. Mary's Hospital wasn't glamorous. No red carpet, no reporters, no excited crowds, only soft fluorescent lights and the quiet rhythm of medicine trying to slow down time. John Wayne was waiting near the entrance. Even wearing his long coat, he looked older than audiences remembered. The years had carved themselves across his face, yet his handshake remained firm. He smiled when he saw Elvis. "I appreciate this." Elvis shook his head. "You didn't have to thank me." John looked away. "I do." Together they walked inside. Nurses recognized Elvis almost instantly. Several froze. One nearly dropped a clipboard. Another whispered, "Is that really him?" Elvis simply smiled politely. No dramatic entrance, no wave, no celebrity performance. Tonight, he wasn't Elvis Presley the superstar, he was simply a visitor. As they walked through the corridors, John quietly explained everything. "The patient's name is Daniel Carter." Elvis listened carefully. 36. So young. He served 2 tours. John's eyes remained forward. He came home with medals. What happened? The war followed him home. Elvis understood immediately. Sometimes wounds weren't visible. John continued. Cancer. Elvis stopped walking. Cancer? John nodded. They discovered it too late. Neither man spoke for several seconds. At the end of the hallway stood an elderly nurse. Her silver hair was tied neatly beneath a cap. She smiled warmly. "You must be Mr. Presley." Elvis extended his hand. "I'm just Elvis." She smiled even wider. "I've taken care of Mr. Carter for 6 months." "How is he?" She hesitated. "He keeps asking what time it is." Elvis frowned. "Why?" "He said," the nurse swallowed gently, "he didn't want to miss you if you came." Those words landed harder than any applause Elvis had ever heard. Not because they praised him, because they carried hope. Hope placed entirely in someone who wasn't even family. Someone the patient had never met. Elvis looked toward the closed hospital door at the end of the corridor. He suddenly felt nervous. Oddly. More nervous than walking on stage before 20,000 people. John noticed. "You okay?" Elvis nodded slowly. "I don't know what to say." John placed one hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to." "Then why am I here?" John smiled faintly. "Because sometimes your presence says everything." The nurse quietly opened the door halfway. Before anyone entered, she whispered, "There's something you should know." Both men looked at her. "He doesn't know you're actually coming." Elvis blinked. "What?" "We never promised him." "Why not?" "Because we didn't want to break his heart if something changed." John lowered his head. The nurse continued. Every evening he asks. She smiled sadly. Do you think Elvis remembered? Elvis closed his eyes. For the first time in many years, the king of rock and roll felt completely speechless. He had performed before presidents. He had entertained royalty. He had broken every record imaginable. Yet nothing had prepared him for one dying man's simple question. Do you think Elvis remembered? Elvis took a slow breath. He gently placed his hand on the doorknob. Inside that room waited someone whose final dream might disappear forever. Unless Elvis found the courage to walk through that door. He looked once toward John Wayne. John gave only a single nod. No speeches, no encouragement, just silent understanding. Elvis slowly turned the handle. The door began to open, and the moment their eyes met, everything Elvis thought he understood about fame was about to change forever. The room was almost completely silent. Only the soft beeping of a heart monitor broke the stillness. Moonlight filtered through partially opened blinds, casting pale silver lines across the floor. A small television sat muted in the corner, its screen glowing faintly without sound. Beside the bed rested a Bible with worn edges, a pair of reading glasses, and an old photograph turned face down. The man lying in the hospital bed looked far older than 36. Cancer had stolen nearly everything from him. His once powerful shoulders had become thin beneath the hospital blanket. His face carried the exhaustion of years spent fighting battles that no one else could see. Daniel Carter slowly turned his head toward the opening door. At first, he didn't react. His tired eyes blinked once, then twice. He stared as though his mind refused to believe what it was seeing. Finally, almost in a whisper, he spoke. No. His voice barely reached the other side of the room. No! A faint smile appeared. This can't be real. Elvis stood quietly near the doorway, still holding his guitar case in one hand. He didn't rush forward. He didn't make a dramatic entrance. He simply smiled. Evening, Daniel. The patient continued staring. His breathing became uneven. I must be dreaming. John Wayne stepped inside behind Elvis. No, son. John smiled gently. You're awake. Daniel's eyes grew wider. He looked from John Wayne back to Elvis. Then tears began filling his eyes before a single word escaped his lips. You, his voice broke, you actually came. Elvis slowly walked closer. I told my friend I'd be here. Daniel laughed through tears. I never thought. He stopped, unable to continue. For several moments no one spoke. Sometimes emotions were too large for language. Elvis carefully set the guitar case against the wall before pulling a chair beside the bed. Instead of towering over the patient, he chose to sit beside him, eye to eye. Like two ordinary men meeting for the first time. He extended his hand. I'm Elvis. Daniel looked at the offered hand for several seconds before taking it with both of his own. His grip was surprisingly weak, yet somehow it felt stronger than thousands of handshakes Elvis had received from politicians, executives, and celebrities. I know who you are. Daniel laughed softly. I've known since I was 15. Everyone smiled, even the elderly nurse standing quietly near the door. Elvis looked around the room. You've got yourself quite a view. Daniel chuckled. If you enjoy parking lots. The joke earned another laugh. Almost immediately the tension disappeared. That surprised everyone. Elvis had an unusual gift. Within minutes he could make strangers feel as though they'd known him for years. "So," Elvis asked, "I hear you served overseas." Daniel nodded. "2 tours. You miss it?" Daniel looked toward the ceiling. "I miss the men." Another pause. "I don't miss the war." John Wayne folded his arms quietly in the corner, saying nothing. He wanted this conversation to belong to them. Daniel noticed Elvis glancing toward an old military photograph lying beside the bed. "My unit." Elvis carefully picked it up. Nearly 20 young soldiers smiled proudly into the camera. "So many faces." Daniel nodded. "Only 11 came home." The room fell silent again. Elvis slowly returned the photograph to the bedside table. "I'm sorry." Daniel shrugged gently. "Life doesn't ask permission." Those words lingered in the air. After a few moments, Daniel smiled again. "You know something funny?" "What?" "I never imagined we'd meet here." Elvis grinned. "Where'd you think we'd meet?" "Backstage." Both men laughed. "I figured maybe someday I'd save enough money," Daniel continued. "I'd buy front-row tickets. My wife always promised she'd surprise me." He looked toward the empty chair beside the bed. "But," his voice softened, "she passed away before we ever got the chance." Elvis's smile slowly disappeared. "I'm sorry." Daniel shook his head. "Don't be. I had 20 wonderful years." He looked toward the window. "I've been lucky." Elvis wasn't sure he agreed. But he understood something important. Some people measured life by how long it lasted. Others measured it by who shared it. Daniel belonged to the second group. A soft knock interrupted them. Another nurse entered carrying medication. She froze. For nearly 3 seconds she simply stared. Then she whispered, "Oh my goodness." Daniel laughed. "See? I told everyone he'd come." The nurse wiped tears from her eyes. "I didn't believe him." Elvis stood. "Would you like me to step outside while you work?" She shook her head. "No," she smiled warmly. "I think he'd rather you stayed." While she adjusted the IV line, Elvis noticed several worn vinyl records stacked neatly beneath the bedside cabinet. Curious, he leaned down. Every single album was one of his own. Some covers had faded from years of use. Others had handwritten notes on them. Daniel smiled. "I've carried those records through 3 different houses." Elvis carefully picked up one of the albums. The edges were worn almost white. "This one's seen better days." Daniel laughed. "I played it too much." Elvis opened the sleeve. Inside was an old newspaper clipping, a concert advertisement from years earlier. The date had been circled in blue ink. "You kept this?" Daniel nodded. "I couldn't afford the ticket, so I bought the newspaper instead." Elvis stared at the clipping. For the first time in years, he realized people didn't collect his music because he was famous. They collected memories, pieces of hope, reminders of happier days. Daniel noticed Elvis becoming quiet. "You okay?" Elvis smiled. "I'm learning more tonight than you realize." John Wayne quietly stepped into the hallway, giving them privacy. Outside, he leaned against the wall. The elderly nurse joined him. "I've never seen Mr. Carter smile like this." John nodded. "I was hoping." She looked toward the room. "I've worked here 32 years. And? I've learned medicine keeps people alive." She smiled sadly. "But sometimes, kindness does even more." John looked through the small window in the hospital door. Inside, Elvis and Daniel were laughing about old cars and Southern cooking, two men from completely different worlds. Yet at that moment, they looked like lifelong friends. Back inside, Daniel suddenly asked, "Can I tell you something embarrassing?" Elvis smiled. "Only if I get to tell one too." Daniel laughed. "Deal." He took a slow breath. "When I was in Vietnam," his eyes drifted toward the ceiling again, "there were nights when we honestly believed we wouldn't see morning." Elvis remained silent. Daniel continued, "We carried a little cassette player. It barely worked. We had one tape." Elvis already knew the answer. "It was yours." Daniel nodded. "When the shelling stopped, we'd play your songs." He smiled faintly. "Not because they reminded us of home." Elvis listened carefully. "They reminded us that home still existed." Those words struck Elvis harder than any award he had ever received. Millions had called him a superstar. Countless magazines had declared him the king. But no trophy, no gold record, no standing ovation had ever sounded as meaningful as one simple sentence. "Your songs reminded us that home still existed." Elvis looked away for a moment, swallowing hard. He had spent years wondering whether music truly changed lives. Tonight, he was finally hearing the answer. Daniel slowly reached beneath his pillow. "There was something I wanted to show you." He carefully removed an old leather wallet. Inside, tucked behind faded family photographs, was a tiny folded piece of paper. Its edges were yellow with age. He unfolded it carefully. Written across it in worn blue ink were the lyrics to one of Elvis's gospel songs. "I copied them by hand." Daniel smiled. "I kept them with me every day." Elvis stared silently. Some of the words had nearly disappeared from years of folding and unfolding. The paper wasn't valuable, it wasn't rare, but to Daniel, it had become priceless. Elvis looked back at him. "You carried this through a war." Daniel nodded. "Every single day." Elvis gently handed the paper back. Neither man noticed that the elderly nurse standing quietly near the doorway had begun crying. She quickly wiped her eyes before anyone saw, because she suddenly understood something extraordinary. Tonight wasn't about a celebrity visiting a patient. It was about one human being discovering just how deeply another human life had been touched, without ever knowing it. And neither Elvis nor Daniel realized that the most unforgettable moment of the night had not happened yet. The room remained quiet long after Daniel folded the worn piece of paper and slipped it back into his wallet. No one spoke. Some silences deserved to be respected. Elvis rested his elbows on his knees, looking at the floor for a moment. He had spent most of his adult life surrounded by screaming crowds, thousands of voices shouting his name, thousands of cameras flashing in his face, yet somehow, one quiet hospital room carried more emotion than every arena he had ever filled. Daniel finally broke the silence. "I've been talking about myself all night." Elvis smiled. "I came here to listen." Daniel shook his head. "No." He pointed gently toward Elvis. "I want to know something." "What?" "When did it stop being fun?" The question caught everyone by surprise. Even the nurse looked toward Elvis. Elvis leaned back slowly. "What makes you think it did?" Daniel smiled knowingly. "Your eyes." Elvis laughed softly. "You notice a lot." "I had plenty of time." The room shared another gentle laugh. Then Elvis looked toward the window. "You really want to know?" "I do." Elvis nodded. "I think—" He paused carefully. "It stopped feeling simple." Daniel listened closely. When I was young, I only wanted to sing. Elvis smiled at the memory. I didn't care about records. I didn't care about money. I just loved watching people smile. He looked down at his hands. Then everything became bigger. Bigger stages. Bigger crowds. Bigger expectations. He sighed quietly. And somehow, the music started carrying all that weight. Daniel nodded without interrupting. Elvis continued. People think fame gives you freedom. He shook his head. Sometimes it gives you the opposite. You become afraid. Afraid of disappointing people. Afraid of slowing down. Afraid they'll stop believing in who they think you are. Daniel smiled gently. But tonight, he looked around the room. You aren't carrying any of that. Elvis glanced at him. No. You know why? Why? Because nobody here needs Elvis Presley. He placed one hand over his own heart. We just needed Elvis. Those words settled deep inside him. For years, managers had spoken about ticket sales. Record executives talked about numbers. Reporters asked about success. Very few people had ever reminded him that underneath all of it, there was still a man. Not an icon, not a legend, just a man. The elderly nurse quietly excused herself and stepped into the hallway. She needed a moment to compose herself. Outside the room, 2 younger nurses had gathered near the station. Is he really singing? One whispered. Not yet. Another nurse smiled. I don't think anyone wants to interrupt. Word had quietly spread throughout the hospital. Doctors passing between floors began slowing their pace. Orderlies found reasons to walk down the same hallway. No announcements had been made. No one called the newspapers. It happened naturally. One person told another, then another. Without anyone planning it, an entire hospital seemed to pause. Back inside, Daniel reached toward the bedside drawer. I almost forgot. He carefully pulled out a small photo album. Its cover had become worn with age. I wanted you to see something. Elvis opened it. The first page showed a young soldier smiling beside a jeep. The second, Daniel and his wife on their wedding day. The third, a little girl sitting on her father's shoulders. My daughter, Daniel said proudly. Emily. Elvis smiled. She's beautiful. She'll be 18 next month. Is she coming tomorrow? Daniel's smile faded slightly. I asked her not to. Elvis looked surprised. Why? I don't want her remembering me like this. Elvis gently closed the album. You know, my mother used to tell me something. Daniel looked up. The people who love you aren't afraid of seeing your weakness. Daniel remained quiet. They're afraid of missing the chance to tell you they love you. The words lingered in the room. Daniel slowly lowered his eyes. I've been trying to protect her. Elvis nodded. I know. But sometimes, he smiled softly, love doesn't need protection. It needs honesty. Daniel stared at the blanket covering his legs. After nearly a minute, he whispered, I've been wrong. John Wayne, still standing near the doorway, quietly looked away. Even he felt his throat tightening. A father wasn't supposed to say goodbye to his daughter this early. Life wasn't supposed to happen that way. Daniel suddenly looked back toward Elvis. Can I ask one more favor? You've earned 100. Daniel smiled. When I was overseas, my buddies and I made a promise. What kind of promise? If any of us ever met you, we'd ask you to sing one gospel song. Elvis laughed softly. I figured this was coming. Daniel smiled. I knew you did. Elvis stood. He walked toward the guitar case, leaning against the wall. The old leather clasps clicked softly as he opened it. The familiar scent of polished wood drifted into the room. He carefully lifted the guitar into his hands. For a moment, he simply looked at it. Not as a performer, not as an entertainer, but as someone about to share a piece of himself. He gently sat back down. No microphone, no spotlight, no orchestra. Only 6 strings and one quiet hospital room. "What would you like to hear?" Daniel answered without hesitation. "Peace in the Valley." Elvis smiled. "I should have guessed." He slowly tuned the guitar. Each string echoed softly through the hallway. Outside, conversations stopped. A doctor carrying patient charts froze. A janitor quietly leaned his mop against the wall. Several nurses exchanged silent glances. Nobody wanted to miss what was about to happen. John Wayne stepped farther into the hallway. He noticed nearly 20 hospital employees standing quietly. No one had asked them to gather. They simply came. One nurse whispered, "Should we tell them to go back to work?" The head nurse shook her head gently. "No." "Some moments," she smiled through tears, "only happen once." Inside the room, Elvis closed his eyes for just a second. Then his fingers brushed across the strings. A warm, gentle chord filled the air. Not loud, not dramatic, just honest. Daniel closed his eyes immediately. The first verse floated softly through the room. Elvis wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't reaching for impossible notes. He sang the way people sing to family, with warmth, with tenderness, with heart. Outside the room, the hallway became completely silent. One by one, doctors stepped out of nearby rooms. Patients slowly opened their doors. Some stood with IV poles beside them. Others remained in wheelchairs. Families waiting through sleepless nights quietly moved closer. Nobody spoke. Nobody checked the time. The song drifted through every corner of the floor like a gentle prayer. Inside, Daniel's breathing became calmer. The tension that had lived across his face for months seemed to disappear. His hands, which had trembled throughout the evening, finally became still. Elvis reached the chorus. His voice remained soft, almost intimate. The words seemed less like lyrics and more like hope itself. The elderly nurse quietly covered her mouth as tears rolled freely down her cheeks. She wasn't alone. Another nurse wiped her eyes, then another. Even the young resident physician standing near the nurse's station lowered his head. John Wayne folded his arms tightly. His jaw remained firm, but his eyes glistened. He had spent a lifetime acting in emotional scenes. Nothing Hollywood had ever written compared to what he was witnessing now. As Elvis reached the final verse, something extraordinary happened. Daniel slowly lifted one trembling hand, not toward Elvis, not toward John, but toward the hallway, toward the dozens of strangers listening together. Without speaking a word, he smiled. And for the first time in many months, he no longer looked like a man waiting to die. He looked like a man who had finally found peace. Elvis gently played the final chord. It echoed softly, then disappeared into complete silence. No applause followed, no cheering, only tears. The silence itself became the standing ovation. But just as Elvis carefully lowered his guitar, Daniel looked toward the door with an expression no one expected. He wasn't finished. There was one final request he had carried in his heart for years, a request so deeply personal that it would leave every person in that hospital unable to hold back their tears. The last note lingered in the room long after Elvis's fingers left the strings. No one moved. No one even seemed willing to breathe too loudly. Outside the room, the hallway had become completely still. Doctors, nurses, patients, families. Every person stood frozen, as though they all understood they had just witnessed something that could never be repeated. Elvis slowly rested the guitar across his lap. He smiled gently at Daniel. "I hope I remembered all the words." Daniel laughed quietly. "You remembered the important ones." The room shared a soft laugh. It wasn't loud. It wasn't forced. It was the kind of laughter that only appears after tears have done their work. Daniel looked toward the ceiling for a long moment. Then he turned back to Elvis. "There is one last thing." Elvis leaned forward. "Anything." Daniel hesitated. His eyes drifted toward the small wooden dresser beside his bed. On top of it rested a folded American flag inside a simple glass display case. Next to it sat 3 military medals. Elvis noticed them immediately. Daniel slowly pointed toward the flag. "Would you hand me that?" Elvis carefully stood and carried the display case back to the bed. He placed it gently across Daniel's lap. Daniel rested trembling fingers on the glass. "I used to think," he smiled faintly, "that surviving the war was the hardest thing I'd ever do." His voice grew softer. "But saying goodbye to the people you love," he swallowed, "that's much harder." John Wayne quietly lowered his head. The elderly nurse reached for another tissue. Daniel carefully opened the display case. He lifted the folded flag with extraordinary care. Every movement was slow. Every touch was respectful. Then he looked at Elvis. "My grandson is only 8 years old." Elvis nodded. "He asks me questions every week." "What kind of questions?" Daniel smiled. "He wants to know if heroes are real." A long silence followed. "I've been thinking about what to tell him." Daniel looked directly into Elvis's eyes. "I've decided." He carefully extended the folded flag toward Elvis. "I want you to give this to him." The room fell silent again. Elvis looked at the flag, then back at Daniel. "I can't." Daniel seemed surprised. "You can't?" Elvis gently shook his head. "No." He slowly pushed the flag back toward Daniel. "This belongs to your family." Daniel smiled sadly. "I know." "Then why me?" "Because if you hand it to him," Daniel whispered, "he'll remember the story forever." Elvis remained quiet for several seconds. Then he placed one hand over Daniel's. "I'll make you another promise." Daniel looked up. "When your grandson is old enough, I'll tell him about tonight. I'll tell him who his grandfather really was. I'll tell him that courage isn't measured by winning battles." He smiled warmly. "It's measured by how kindly a man treats people after the battle is over." Daniel's eyes immediately filled with tears. "So," Elvis continued, "you should be the one who gives him this flag." Daniel slowly nodded. For the first time, he understood. Some gifts could never be passed through strangers. They had to travel from one generation to the next, directly, with love. Daniel carefully returned the folded flag to its case. Then he reached for one of the medals lying beside it. "This one," he smiled, "I'd like you to have." Elvis immediately shook his head. "I couldn't." "I insist." No, Elvis smiled. You earned it. Daniel laughed quietly. And you've earned something too. Elvis looked confused. What? Daniel reached toward the bedside drawer once more. Instead of another medal, he removed the old newspaper advertisement that Elvis had seen earlier. The edges had become fragile with age. He held it out. I've carried this for 20 years. I want you to sign it. Elvis laughed softly. I thought you were about to give me another impossible decision. The room filled with gentle laughter again. A nurse quickly found a pen. Elvis carefully unfolded the faded newspaper. For a long moment, he simply stared at it. A young Elvis smiled confidently from the advertisement. Bright eyes, endless energy, unlimited dreams. He quietly smiled to himself. So much hair. Daniel laughed harder than anyone had heard all evening. You noticed that too? Elvis signed slowly, but instead of writing only his name, he paused, then added a short message beneath it. To Daniel, thank you for reminding me why I started singing. With love, Elvis Presley. When Daniel read the words, he pressed the paper against his chest, unable to speak, unable to hide the tears flowing freely down his face. Outside the room, the elderly nurse quietly wiped her eyes again. John Wayne whispered, "That's worth more than any award." The nurse nodded, not because he signed it. She looked through the doorway, because he meant every word. Several minutes passed peacefully. No one felt the need to rush. Elvis and Daniel spoke about childhood memories, Southern cooking, fishing trips, old pickup trucks. The conversation no longer felt like a farewell. It felt like two old friends making up for years they had never shared. Eventually, Daniel became tired. His breathing slowed. The medication was beginning to take effect. The elderly nurse stepped closer. He should rest. Elvis nodded. I understand. He stood quietly. For a brief moment, neither man knew how to say goodbye. Daniel finally reached out his hand. Elvis took it firmly. Thank you, Daniel whispered. No. Elvis smiled through misty eyes. Thank you. Daniel frowned slightly. For what? Elvis looked around the room, then toward the hallway filled with people. For reminding me that one song, one conversation, one act of kindness can matter more than 1,000 sold-out concerts. Daniel smiled. I knew you'd understand. Elvis gently squeezed his hand one last time. I'll see you again. Daniel looked at him carefully. Maybe not here. Elvis smiled. Maybe somewhere with better music. Daniel laughed softly. I'll save you a seat. Elvis picked up his guitar. John Wayne quietly opened the door. As Elvis stepped into the hallway, he stopped. Every person standing there looked toward him. No one applauded, no one shouted. Instead, one by one, the nurses lowered their heads. Doctors placed their hands over their hearts. Patients smiled through tears. An elderly woman sitting in a wheelchair softly whispered, God bless you. Another patient quietly said, Thank you. Soon, the words spread through the hallway. Not loudly, almost like a prayer. Thank you. God bless you. Thank you. Elvis didn't know where to look. He had accepted countless standing ovations throughout his career. But this silent corridor, filled with ordinary people, meant more than any arena he had ever performed in. He simply placed one hand over his heart, then bowed his head without saying a word. As he and John Wayne walked toward the hospital exit, neither man spoke. The cool night air greeted them outside. Las Vegas still sparkled in the distance. The casinos remained full. The music continued. The city never slept. John finally broke the silence. "You know, I've spent my whole life pretending to be heroes." He looked at Elvis. "Tonight, I watched one." Elvis smiled faintly. "I didn't do anything special." John shook his head. "That's exactly why you did." Before getting into his car, Elvis looked back at the glowing hospital windows. Somewhere behind one of them, a man who had faced war, loss, and illness had found peace, not because of fame, but because someone had taken the time to simply show up. Years later, many people would remember Elvis Presley as the king of rock and roll. They would remember the records, the concerts, the movies, the fame, the nurses who had stood in that hallway, the doctors who had quietly stopped working for a few precious minutes, the patients who had listened from their doorways, remembered something entirely different. They remembered a man who walked into a hospital carrying a guitar, and walked out carrying a renewed understanding of his own purpose. Because on that quiet night, Elvis Presley didn't just fulfill one last wish. He rediscovered the reason he had ever started singing in the first place. And for everyone who was there, that was the performance they would never forget.